Hello, and welcome to the Texas System of Care Cultural and Linguistic Competence Podcast. My name is Shannon Moreno, and I'm the CLC, or Cultural and Linguistic Competence Specialist, with Texas System of Care. This podcast is devoted towards how to work with specific populations within your local system of care community and ensure that you're providing services that are culturally and linguistically appropriate. This series is focused on working with the Latino community. For a further explanation of CLC terminology, including terms used in this podcast, we recommend checking out the ABCs of CLC webinar series. Today we continue the conversation with Dr. Manuel Zamarripa, Professor of Counseling at South University in Round Rock, Texas. I think it's important to also mention something we haven't mentioned before is the expansive, variety and diversity within the Latino population. Of course, when we talk about working with a population, we have to speak in generalizations, right? And sometimes when folks hear that, they can think that moves over into the area of stereotypes. And sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to differentiate between those. But I just want to take a moment, for listeners, that we are talking in generalizations, which as opposed to stereotypes, are components of a culture that do tend to have been shown to be true, and that members of that particular cultural group, even if for they themselves as individuals may say this aspect is not true about me, they would still say overall for this population that is generally true. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. Doctor, could you speak a little bit though to the variety within the population as far as customs and background, as well as issue of acculturation and really the need for a provider to not just look at a checkbox but genuinely know the person they're interacting with?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of points to start, a lot of entry points in this conversation with this topic. But I think I'll begin with two. And one you mentioned is the notion of acculturation. And relatedly, definitely not as a substitute at all, is generational status. Generally in the literature, it can be a little confusing, but generally when we talk about first generation, what they mean is immigrant. So someone that has come over as an immigrant is considered first generation. Second generation is being born in the United States, having parents, or at least one parent that is or was an immigrant. And then third generation is both parents born in the United States and you yourself born in the United States. Okay, so your experiences are going to be very different based on your generational status. In terms of your connection with your culture of origin and what you're learning and experiencing in the United States. So relatedly is acculturation, right? Acculturation is how one group begins to interact and accept or not accept certain behaviors or cultural norms of a larger group. Now, the mistake that we used to make often, and I don't think we do it as often now, or at least not publicly, is one of the measures that we use to see how acculturated one is. And the more acculturated you are, that means the more you're connected with or want to move toward the larger society that you're in. The less acculturated you are, the more you're holding on to your culture of origin.
Which in the U.S. would be kind of like a European-American kind of framework.
Absolutely. So one of the markers was language. And if you're coming from a Latin American country, and you spoke Spanish, and that was your primary language, and you're in the United States, and that's still your primary, your dominant, or your sole language, that was usually the only marker that was used to determine how acculturated you are. And if you spoke English, then you were more acculturated. What we've known now for actually decades is that's a very false reading. In the very rough overview, if someone is solely, we'll say because of the population we're talking about, solely Spanish speaking, then there are definitely some things that we can begin with, which is probably are very connected to their culture of origin. However, we still need to know as mental health providers the degree of years the person has been in the country, because he or she may have adapted certain beliefs, certain attitudes, certain ideas about health and health care that's not going to translate just because they speak Spanish. So they may be more acculturated in some ways than in others. We're not going to know that. Similar with second and third generation Latino clients. They may speak predominantly English, but they may be less acculturated in their way of family loyalty or cultural identity.
Yeah.
I mean, I have contemporaries, peers, that when they were in kinder and in first grade were automatically put into bilingual programs because of their ethnicity, and were third, fourth generation Mexican Americans. And so this is already in the in the 80s, which is way past the times that we believe that should have been happening.
Yeah.
So having a more dynamic idea of what acculturation is going to be important. Their views of family, their views of family loyalty, their views of connectedness to however they define their culture of origin. But if they say they're very connected to it or not, or through conversation, we're able to find out, then that's going to probably have a role in how they view the providers, how they view mental health, how they view their own wellness. So those are some entry points to help us kind of see the perspectives of the clients that we have. But also the variety in the Latino population definitely comes from coming from origins of different countries throughout Latin America, right? We know that one of the key themes in all of Latin America is the reason why Spanish is spoken and Portuguese in Brazil was because of the European colonization and conquests, right? So a lot of Spanish culture and Portuguese culture was brought over and imposed on all the Latin American countries. And then, of course, we have all the indigenous peoples that were there before. I mean, we talk about indigenous peoples it's funny, the political borders we use when we're talking about Latin America. When we're talking about the United States, we talk about Native Americans or American Indians, and it's the same thing,
Right.
Indigenous peoples. And so just as there are commonalities with Native Americans in the United States, there are commonalities in terms of all indigenous perspectives on life, views of the world. And so there are some distinctions about that, and about the way time is viewed. We don't have time to get into all of that, but so those are the commonalities. The distinctions are there are different tribes, right? There are different nations, and so that lends to the variety of the Latino population. So we need to know how connected the clients are to their country of origin or their heritage, how connected their family may be. Because again, if we're talking with an individual, they may give one view, and you ask about their family, it's completely different. Their family may be very connected, and they are not. So, or the opposite. So that's going to be really important to try to filter.
Absolutely. And I think that's such an incredibly important point is for providers to have that understanding that there is so much variety within Latin America. And I think oftentimes there's kind of one perception of what a Latino looks like or acts like or values. And that's just not the case. Again, we can talk in generalizations, and that's a lot of what we're doing here in this podcast. But at the end of the day, it comes down to, as you mentioned before, you have to have those conversations. And you have to have those conversations with those open-ended questions that really gets at, the person. What is their experience? What are their perceptions? What's their understanding of their relationship with family, relationship with a higher power? Where do they feel that their issues are coming from? Those are the types of things that we have to get at who the person is. Because, you may have one client who checks the box, Hispanic, and they may be a second generation Afro-Latino,
right.
From Dominican Republic, who may have very different experiences than a fourth or fifth generation Mexican American.
Absolutely.
And so those are incredibly important things to get at. And so I think the more that, providers and really the system as a whole can kind of not do away with the checklist, because as you said before, there's purpose and reason behind that, but actually having those more holistic conversations to get at an understanding. That's such an incredibly important piece. I kind of want to go off in a direction. You started to talk a little bit about, Spain and Portugal and the conquistadors coming over and that history in Latin America. I want to have a conversation about historical trauma.
Sure.
And in the Latino community, of course, there's going to be some fairly common occurrences in history that could lend to historical trauma in current day individuals. And there's also some more localized traumas that may have taken place within specific populations. For example, within the Mexican American community, there may be some specific traumas. Can you talk first of all about what exactly is historical trauma in general? How does it impact generations today, where maybe the trauma happened a very long time ago, and then how you've seen it in your practice?
Well, I think in the United States, we've talked, I guess more recently, the idea of historical trauma has come out with some conversations and some research with some of the Native American tribes, because that's a clear example of how the government, in its expansion westward, we already, of course, need to talk about this as a country, is, a lot of the forcible removal of natives, American Indians, from their land, and some killings, and so that a lot that happened. So how does that affect 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 generations afterwards? We talk about, in terms of African Americans coming to this country as slaves and their treatment, and being removed from their families when they got here, the families that they had, being separated from their families, and being enslaved, right? And then we'll talk about here for Mexicans and Mexican Americans, a lot of the traumatic experiences, one for the continuing immigrant experience with the border crossing and that, all that trauma that can have, but also the U.S.-Mexican War that took some of the northern Mexican land and all of the trauma that's associated with. Okay, so some examples.
Because the individuals, and I think that's a piece that sometimes people forget about the aftermath of that war, is that the individuals living in that land stayed where they were as the border. So in that particular case, the border actually crossed the individuals. Right.
So they were then, as the phrase uses, they were then foreigners in their own land,
right,
from one day to the next, right? And there was definitely, a lot of discriminatory views against Mexicans at that point. And so they were not treated well. And so that's coming out more and more. It's always been there in the history, but it's becoming, more and more public. So the idea of historical trauma is that when you do something on such a large scale to a community within a relatively short period of time in terms of the ways in which communities develop, and sometimes over a couple of generations, you're talking about Native Americans and you're talking about some of the Mexican descent people, and even with slavery, those were generations lived in those situations. Then those populations find ways to respond to trauma, to hardship, to being devalued, to living in survival mode, right? And so, as we know, our environment and our experiences change us genetically, shift us, and then when we have children, those are passed down, right? So there's a biological piece to it, right? That's already being substantiated by research, right? About how you respond to trauma, right? So this is the problem with the westernized medical model that treated in mental health, that treated individuals as just individual capsules. Like, I'm going to treat what's happening with you in your thoughts and change your thoughts around as if you are a self-contained unit, brand new with no connection to your parents or your community. And we know that we are open. Our biology is open, and our mind is open, and we learn from and are affected by our interactions and our situations and our parents and how we were raised. So when you're talking about community trauma, trauma that's happened to an entire community historically, and they have to deal with how to survive. They have to respond to stress. They have to make sure that their kids aren't outside after dark.
Yeah.
And kids are going to be kids, so they're going to try to do that. So you make sure that you yell at them, maybe. You get them in there, you close the door. You're not very gentle about that sometimes to make sure that they're inside or they'll be killed possibly, right? Guess what? Those kids learn how to parent it that way. Parents don't tell them the context of that. And guess what? Those kids who have kids learn how to parent that way. And guess what? Those kids who have kids learn to be nervous and worried about not being outside after dark or listening to me right away when I say something, because that's what you do. Because the parents that initially had to do that may or may not have said, you're going to be killed. They would say what our parents say, because I'm your mom, you listen to me. Because I'm your dad, you listen to me. And those ways of being and those ways of interacting and those ways of responding to stress, because they've been learned in one generation, are passed down. It's very common sense. It's just like any other family that passes down ways of raising their kids, because the experiences that a family has had. Well, the experiences your family has had has been traumatic and have been life or death or have been about survival, then those ways of interacting and those ways of seeing the world in a fearful way sometimes are just passed down as how you raise kids, how you interact, the things you do to be safe. And so all of a sudden you look up and, okay, there's no slavery anymore. There are a lot of other issues. But, the context has changed. And we're dealing with kids and families that seem to have a lower tolerance for stress or seem to have a quicker quicker anger response. And we're looking at individual interventions, and we're looking at how they're treated in the schools. And all of those things are important. But there is this piece of historical trauma that has been passed down as a means of survival.
Yeah. And I think an important piece that you did speak to in that, and I just want to reiterate and highlight, is that in the passing down of that trauma, it's a combination of physiologically what's being passed down in utero from mother to baby,
Absolutely.
And then carried on throughout, as well as observed or learned behaviors. I mean, both of those are having an impact. And so outside of community and historical trauma, if we just look at an individual family, and sometimes we see, for example, if there's sexual abuse, sometimes that traumatic experience can be transmitted down. Just for folks who don't have a lot of familiarity with historical trauma, if you imagine that and then really compound that with everyone in your community, your total support network as a whole experiencing these incredibly traumatic situations in the open, and having that being accepted and a part of life by larger society, it really is compounded, and it does lay down. So I appreciate what you said, that you can look up today and say, well, slavery is over, or this war is over, or this specific traumatic occurrence is over, but the consequences in a population is not necessarily over and done with.
Right.
And what continues to re-traumatize is systems or providers who don't have that picture and don't take that into account. Can you talk a little bit how that understanding of the historical trauma piece, how you feel that you've been able to bring that into your practice, and how has that maybe in some situations, changed your approach or how you've talked about things?
Well, the thing that always, for me, that I see personally that I've been working with, that I look for, is how families respond when fear is a motivator. How they respond to their own self-care, how they respond to the raising of their kids, how they respond in their interactions. When, as we talk through it, it's some degree of fear of safety or fear of loss, or a protective motivation. So, I may or may not talk directly about historical trauma with the clients, but I do talk about how patterns are passed down. And if appropriate, a little bit about how it's passed down biologically as well, the way what we learn. And So I talk really about where did you learn and why was it important to show that I have parenting on my brain, so I'll go with that, to show that you're a good parent. When your kids come in from being outside, that you immediately make sure that they don't bring in dirt or mud. You make sure that they understand it and they stop and they go back outside and they clean up your mess and pay attention. What I try to distinguish in the conversations, in therapy, in the process, is distinguishing between, okay, when is this like, oh, wait a minute, we want to learn like not to do that, or you're trying to teach your kid to do that, or you don't want things to get dirty. That's a different response than, because the clients don't usually articulate this until we talk about it. Mm-hmm. It's like, it really is like the world's going to end if you don't, wait, stop, you can't do that. And there's this emotional response about making sure that they don't do that. Mm-hmm. That's beyond the, they're going to get, the carpet dirty, so I want to make sure. And that's when we start noticing there's this, unnamed real fear that's there. And then I ask them to talk about where that came from in other parts in their life. Like, were their parents like that, or their aunt, or their grandmother, or, just kind of a broader, and how that was passed down. One example that I bring up, because for a lot of Latinos, there is also this overwhelming majority that in the United States that have come from poverty, right? And so a lot of the times, if you walked around barefoot, or you stayed wet and in the rain, or your feet were wet, there are these stories of making sure that you dry yourself off real quick. You know that because you'll get sick, right? And so as a parent, now what you hear is, I don't want my child to get sick. And they use the same, intense response that your parent used about, wait a minute, don't do that. Make sure you dry yourself off, or make sure that you're not walking around barefoot, or whatever the case is. But what we don't understand is that your mom's mom or your grandmother did that because there could have been this extreme poverty where you took every precaution to keep your kid healthy because the doctor wasn't going to come out. Yeah. And if the doctor didn't come out, then you could get even more sick or possibly die. That's the same vein of historical trauma, that same piece of patterns that are learned out of survival that are just passed down. And so as a kid, you learn to respond, not just, as I said, the piece of keeping the house clean or keeping whatever, making sure they learn the rules, but you can sense there's another response in there, that fear response. A lot of the times the clients don't even realize that they have that piece, and so we're trying to. Then they'll notice when we talk about their families, how they responded. It's like, oh yeah, it was very, like, we talk about what might they have been scared of. Did your mom even know what she was scared of? Maybe it was what your grandmother was scared might happen to you that caused this response about what you do or don't do as a kid. Does that make sense?
That does. Yeah. And I think, if folks can have the radar, I know I've said radar so many times, but I just feel that's what it boils down to. Yeah. Oftentimes is having knowledge that there could be more behind this. If you have a youth who is complaining about an overprotective parent or something like that, if you come from a European American framework, regardless of what your individual race or ethnicity is, if you're kind of trained in that boxy way, and as you said before, I'm dealing with this individual right now at this point in time, and there's not this bigger picture of what has happened in previous generations, then are you going to dig up some underlying issues of what's going on in that conflict, or are you more likely to take an approach of telling the youth and or telling their parent what to do in order to solve this issue that's going on? And you may just be missing the bigger picture of the situation. Absolutely. I don't know if you have, I'm kind of putting you on the spot with this question a little bit. Do you have an example of a time when you did feel that in a particular situation there was a historical trauma piece at play?
I think there definitely have been several times, and I'm thinking about the work that I do with adolescents. Not as much over the last year or so, but for some years before that, I was working pretty consistently with adolescent boys mostly, and mostly adolescents of color. And so there were several times, and so I'll just kind of put them all together. But for sure, working with kids that are being raised by grandparents, right? And in the stories of kids having behavioral problems because they're problems because they don't fit into how they need to behave in the school, right? So they're having behavioral issues, and then talking with the grandmother, usually, about how they discipline and why they discipline and what they think is appropriate behavior and inappropriate behavior, and talking with, the grandmother didn't grow up here. They grew up, in this other part of the country, and in that other part of the country, talking about stories with the grandmother about some of the experiences that community had gone through, and just knowing a little bit that they had been there for a couple of generations, and then asking about, what was it like, when you were growing up, and what seemed to be important as a child to listen. What was an important piece of being a child to show that you were a good child, to listen to your parents. And so in those ways, it's really clear that there has been some experiences passed down, because then you talk about people that were murdered, you talk about people that were killed, a lot of times the men, and stories come up about violent deaths, right? And so these are not directly related to the kids I'm seeing, but grandmother's father, grandmother's uncle, other men in the community that are really in the memories and in the stories of the client's parents that I'm talking with. Right? And it's really not that hard to access those conversations. It's really not that far back when you start talking about a little bit about the parental experiences, because they're going to bring all of those stories. And so then you see similar things happening with the kids that I'm working with. The difficulties with the men in their lives and the fathers in their lives, and whether they're present or not. I mean, if you look back at it and take away the particulars of the specific situations that the men and the fathers in the lives of these boys are involved with, the particular situation, the general situation is very much the same. There's conflict, there's little opportunity, there's conflict with authorities in society, living outside, the norm of what's accepted. And so all of those things are pretty easy to access and to trace once you open the conversation.
Yeah. And then once you discover that as a provider, the steps you then take to try to work with the youth and with the family as a whole to solve whatever behavioral concerns are going on. I mean, really those behavioral concerns, you realize they're just a symptom of these underlying issues. And so your whole approach changes from, if you had just sat down with that youth and never really taken the time to get to know the grandmother and get to know the story of the family, if you just focus on that one individual youth and their perspectives of what's going on, likely you would go a completely different direction, with approaches that may by happenstance and luck help, but that's really what it would be, is happenstance and luck. If that happens to hit the nail on the head in one form or another, it's really much more likely that the approach would not be effective because it's not treating the underlying issue that's going on.
When you can point out those patterns and you can talk about those patterns, then I have had the conversation where now the treatment and the parenting and the treatment with the boys in front of me definitely can add the piece of shifting. So this is what we know is important and going to be good for the boys, and this is but you could be changing the patterns of these boys and their generations forward about not having some of all of these different events that have happened and these tragedies that have happened. So sometimes you can really have, you won't necessarily say historical trauma to them, but you can definitely say, this is why this treatment is so important. because they need it now, they need it for their future, but we're also possibly shifting generations of similar patterns. And we're part of doing this, and we can do this. You can shift, the legacy of your family. And those conversations and saying that make sense. Yeah. It's not odd to say that as a mental health professional if you've got some of these stories that have been told to you. So.
And again, that goes back to having an understanding of the explanatory model of the person, right? Because if you start to pick up on some signs of historical trauma or really any issue that you believe is going on, if you're talking with someone who they themselves, maybe they've gone through a lot of acculturation, maybe you're fourth or fifth generation, they themselves do ascribe to medicinal model quite a bit themselves, then maybe you would have some conversations about what exactly historical trauma is from that physiological perspective of that trauma being passed down. And maybe not. Maybe you would word that completely differently. It's all still describing what is going on and what is happening, but in a way that, again, it's about having that teamwork approach and really getting to know your families holistically at a positive level. I hope you enjoyed today's CLC podcast on working with the Latino community. If you have any questions on how to bring CLC initiatives into your local system of care community, please feel free to email us at info@txsystemofcare.org.